Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Ben Johnson, the head of early stage life science at Silicon Valley Bank.
Get started. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We're very glad you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. A special thank you to our partners at the law firm Cooley. They are sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. And this morning, we're joined by Ben Johnson from Silicon Valley Bank. So we're going to talk all things that you would expect, and then maybe some things you might not expect, as Ben has spent a large amount of time talking to, advising, and helping early stage companies. So as always, the housekeeping, please. We know you'll have questions for Ben throughout the course of our conversation. Please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and Derek and I will get to them throughout the course of our conversation. With that, I'll kick it over to Derek to kick off our introductions. Thanks.
All right. Well, Ben and I could probably spend an hour talking about the Stanley Cup Finals, but I don't know that we're going to do that this morning. I'm excited to talk to you that we could, right? I mean, it could all be over tonight. There's a lot to talk about there. But Ben has carved out a really terrific career in biotech financing, and I think one of the big themes that's going to come up over and over again is it's really people that make this business go. And I think we've got a lot to dive into there. So Ben, it's wonderful to have you. Before we do that, we usually tend to start with an origin story, but before we do that today, why don't you give all of us a little bit of update on where SVB stands now? I think everybody remembers all of the news, but why don't you give us kind of an update on the state of where SVB is, what business looks like, and where you stand now?
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's actually been a lot of, I was at a bio last week in Boston and talked to hundreds of people. And it's clear to me there's still a lot of confusion out there in the market because there's so many different things happening with so many different banks right now. That I appreciate the opportunity to just offer some clarity. So the very, very short story is that Silicon Valley Bank failed on March 10th, and a few weeks later was acquired by First Citizens Bank and is now operating as a wholly owned, separately operated division of First Citizens. And so it's definitely business as unusual in the sense that we went through a massive traumatic experience and that pieces of the old SVB business are still sorting themselves out, namely the investment bank and our fund of funds business. But the commercial bank and the private bank, which is the vast majority of Silicon Valley Bank's operating businesses, are now being basically capitalized by First Citizens Bank. And so it feels ironically feels very normal right now for a 16-year veteran of SVB to be moving forward, aside from the fact that this has created a more dynamic, more competitive market where there are a lot of banks who are trying to enter the innovation economy. And so the competitive dynamic is sort of weird. And then the banking capitalization conversation is very weird with where interest rates are right now. And most banks are having great difficulty with their asset liability management, which was the main sort of thing that SVB was struggling with leading up to the bank run that caused its failure. And so the real big benefit of being a part of First Citizens is that when you take a commercial bank like SVB that has a high amount of highly concentrated commercial deposits, and you marry that to a retail bank that has a very diversified retail deposit base, the probability that you have a bank run that would create sort of a catastrophic moment goes way, way, way down because the diversity of the deposit base is so broad. And so if you look across the landscape, any bank who is operating in the innovation economy these days, I think SVB was probably the last really fully independent innovation oriented bank. All of these banks are now married to banks that have a retail presence because it just makes the underlying asset liability management a lot stronger. So anyway, so for SVB, the big thing that people need to know is we're not out of business. We're actually doing business as usual in our normal way. We're just doing it under the ownership of, moving from being an independent publicly traded company to being a division of another publicly traded company.
Yeah. And I think we can get to some of the macro stuff a little later. The thing that I found really, surprising, I suppose, was as rumors were kind of, floating around as the news was hitting, the question was like, well, is First Republic next? You get to think like, why is all of this so fragile, or is all of this so fragile? right? I'm
Yep.
glad that things are kind of, back to usual and bolstered now, but the really terrifying thing is, you never kind of realize how fragile things are until something actually breaks. And, that just sends, shockwaves through really the entire ecosystem, which, has consequences, for a whole lot of other things that shouldn't really happen. Anyway, why don't we wind the clock back and talk a little bit about you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about how'd you get here in the first place?
Yeah, it's ironic too, because I think I would have failed every biology class I would have ever taken. So for me, my strong suit is not science at all. I'm the first person in my family to go to college and wound up studying finance. And I think it's funny, I think Freud would have a heyday with this. I studied finance because I grew up in a very unstable household financially. And I think I felt like I didn't want that for myself. I wanted to have a stable adulthood, if you will. And I felt like studying finance was going to be the way that I could get there. Ironically, though, I'm a total right brain. So studying finance for me was like being a fish out of water. But ended up with two degrees in finance, started my career in banking because I wanted to go into industry, but I didn't know which industry to go into. So I thought banking would be like a good place to start. And here I am 25 years later, still in banking. After 10 years of being in banking, I was at Wells Fargo and at US Bank. I wasn't getting enough creative energy out of those businesses because they weren't working with the parts of the economy that I felt were like driving civilization forward. And so in 2007, Silicon Valley Bank hired me to lead the state of Minnesota, which is where I reside. And that was, for me, that was like leaving the industry because Silicon Valley Bank was always viewed as being sort of a non-bank culture, but offering banking services and value. So for me, it was a perfect match between sort of my right brain and then my skill set. And then, of course, Minneapolis is a medtech hub. And so I found myself financing a ton of medtech activity. And that started my foray into the life science world. And so I went from being geo Minnesota to life science and healthcare Midwest to life science and healthcare between the mountain ranges to now for the last 5 years, seed stage life science for the US. And so the first decade of my career at SVB was very venture debt heavy. I financed hundreds of companies, deployed over $1 billion of capital into, basically either pre-revenue or pre-cash flow positive life science and healthcare companies across all of the verticals that we cover, of which biopharma is the largest vertical. And then for the last 5 years haven't actually done any lending because it's virtually impossible to do lending in seed stage, but have been trying to figure out how to ensure that Silicon Valley Bank's brand is on the minds of first-time founders in healthcare and life science, so that as they're thinking about, their various strategic partners to help them, that Silicon Valley Bank and, innovation-focused banks are on that radar.
Yeah.
So that's sort of kind of my origin story of how I got here. But my superpowers are in the realm of connecting, collaborating, facilitating, pattern recognizing. I don't have all the answers, but I try to come up with all the questions, I guess is how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head on a lot of things that make SVB special, and probably are a large part of the reason that it achieved the status that it has. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because you mentioned, kind of the dichotomy between the Wells Fargos and the classic like big banks of the world, and then kind of this upstart SVB type culture. So what is generally the ethos around SVB? What are some of the things that you kind of try to preach when you are either looking for new companies to work with, or when you kind of bring people onto your team and say, hey, listen, this is what we do? Like, how do you try and encapsulate that?
Yeah, SVB is filled with people who are constantly in wonder of the things around them. So SVBers have an innate curiosity for the unexplained or the unthinkable, and we gravitate toward founders because founders are trying to do things that have never been done before. So SVBers are generally very comfortable with ambiguity, are very strong learners. In SVB, you're constantly finding yourself having to learn about new technologies and try to quickly understand things that you've never heard of before. So you have to be comfortable allowing yourself to be in that environment. And like for myself, I crave that. So for me, it gets me up every morning to have an opportunity to help founders who are, trying to change the world in ways that, yesterday I didn't even know were possible. But then, SVBers generally are productive people. We want to make a difference. And then now granted, I've hired scientists who are on my team who are offering scientific sort of orientation to their advice. I'm not a scientist at all, but the thing that we all have in common is enthusiasm for disruptive innovation. So some of us have some scientific basis. Some of them have like myself, have more of a muscle memory basis. And then we collaborate internally, work together to try to help find ways to improve the probability of success for founders. So it's sort of like a lot of the things that SVBers possess are some of the same skill sets that founders need to be successful. And they are related to just being comfortable with ambiguity and having just an insatiable curiosity for learning and being productive.
So you talked a little bit about, you said earlier, basically sort of what questions, right, to ask. So let's say I'm a founder, and I'm a first-time founder trying to figure out sort of what to do. Obviously, I have some, friends and family money, right? Maybe some angel money. What do I even need to ask about, like, banking? Like, what do I even look for in a banking relationship other than a place to put my money and be able to pay my immediate bills?
Yeah, it's not about product, that's for sure. And even though we're having a lot of conversations these days about product because of the whole notion around how do you ensure that your deposits are safe, the essence of the relationship is actually more qualitative. It's about having access to a banker who has information asymmetry, who can help you with pattern recognition in ways that you just can't empirically discover yourself. And then for banks who specialize in that activity, they have more information asymmetry than banks that don't. And so that's sort of the difference maker. It's qualitative sort of relationship orientation. But what's fascinating to me is that with the advent of non-latent video communication, we're able to scale that in ways now that are a lot easier than when we were doing it over the phone. It's interesting to me how when you combine facial communication, if you will, with sonic communication, that it actually enables trust and empathy to happen better. Yeah. And so it enables us to leverage that, I think, more effectively sociologically. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing a decentralization of financing rounds in the US right now. I think it's because investors and founders are finding ways to manage trust in ways that they haven't been able to do before. But for the banking part of it, it's sort of like, you want to surround yourself with strategic partners who have the most possible relevancy over the life cycle of your company. So it is qualitative, but then as you go down the road and you raise your Series A or your Series B and you start talking about concepts such as venture debt, very few banks do venture debt. And so, most banks require 3 years of profitability before they will, or financeable receivables before they finance your company. Well, life science and healthcare founders never generate a dollar of revenue in the life cycle of their company. So you need a lender who understands how to lend money into a clinical stage company. Very few lenders have that expertise. So there is product expertise sort of on the debt side of it when it comes to capital. But that product expertise is also a reflection on the qualitative information asymmetry that organization possesses. And they rely on that pattern recognition and that muscle memory to help inform them on making qualitative decisions on deploying debt into a company that obviously is not going to repay you back with cash flow. They're repaying your loan with an exit. And so it's those things that, and the reason why SVB built a seed stage business only 5 years ago, we've been around for 40 years, but we haven't really gotten around to doing seed stage until 5 years ago, is what we have found is that we can't wait until Series A and until the debt conversation happens to start building trust with founders. We have to build that trust as soon as possible after that company is formed. So this is, all about trust building and managing trust and all that.
Yeah, and it also, not everyone in the venture debt industry is what I'll call a non-predatory venture debt lender, right? There are some places you kind of don't want to go, and all of this boils down to the people around the founders that can help them make good choices, right? So, and this actually dovetails into what I was thinking about in terms of, it's hard to raise money right now, right? So how do you, even if you have kind of a just a first meeting with a founder or with an entrepreneur, what are some of the ways that you try and build trust, and what are some of the ways that you gauge kind of how you're going to help this person, whether they're a client or not, right? Especially in an environment where there's going to be a lot of firms and a lot of customers looking for help.
Yeah, part of it is just going through the pitch. That's the best starting point, is just to get a sense of, what is this founding team trying to accomplish? And then we look at pitches multiple times every day. And so muscle memory off of pitch, trying to balance between science and, sort of scientific oriented investors versus lay investors, and sort of making sure you have different versions of your pitch available depending upon who you're talking to. And so just talking through that is a big part of it. Muscle memory on who's investing in what is also another important thing. So just sort of paying attention to activity levels. I would tell you, though, that it is very difficult to do that at the seed stage, because the data just isn't as good. So it's a lot more about just having your sort of ear down to the rail and just sort of trying to get a sense of, just at an activity basis, who's investing in what. This is, by the way, why the early stage life science team at Silicon Valley Bank is geo-agnostic and is subsector focused. So the thinking there is, if all you have to focus on all day long is med tech or health tech or biopharma or DX tools, and if you're in the biopharma space, it's actually a distraction to also try to keep up on what's happening in med tech. So we break that down, have in vitro relationships with our clients, which enables us to cover a larger geography, and then have our in vivo experiences at places like bio. And then that enables us to power a sector focused approach that enables us to do a better job, we think anyway, a better job of sort of investor pattern recognition, investor discovery, sort of pitch recognition, pitch discovery. And so it's things like that. But it's also like, who are the other service providers around you, and how well do we know them, and who are you using for your contract CFO company? And if it's Cooley your attorney, well, we know Cooley. And so there's some of that. And then the other thing too, I would say, is pattern recognition around exit timeframes and sort of dollars that go into different technologies to get to an exit. And then the final thing I would say is just we're trying to pay attention to the types of companies that are helping founders get through clin dev better, faster, cheaper. Okay. And so who are some of the other service providers that are not really, that are more actually operational, related to the science, that we're noticing? Because we're actually financing, part of our business line in the world of DX tools or health tech is actually companies who are helping life science founders through using, AI ML for clin dev, or having relationships with CROs who are scaling their efforts to, because what we're seeing now is a lot of companies are totally virtual. They have zero location. They're not taking down lab space at all. And then they're outsourcing 100% of their lab activity through CROs. We're seeing that. And just trying to make sure that we're sort of prescient on the issue and able to help companies, sort of angle on, what's the optimal use of their early stage time and capital.
Well, we think it's very important to be located in New York, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, and what's fascinating to me is New York is at the top of the stack right now for early stage activity. And so I track every quarter. I go through and find I leverage PitchBook, CipherBio, and SVB's proprietary data, and go through every single early stage transaction that I can get my hands on. And then I aggregate the data, and then I pay attention to where things are happening geographically. And New York is absolutely one of the brightest spots in the US right now for early stage, just across all of life science and healthcare activity. So you're absolutely right. There's an absolute community that is in full force right now. I can absolutely see it in the math.
Yeah.
Well, it's very nice to have the math back up the feeling, I suppose. I mean, there's been a really good energy here for a long time, but it's always nice when the numbers play that out too. Yep. It's interesting. Something you said before just kind of brought back here. You say that there's companies that are, either fully virtual or, siteless in a way. And you had talked before about kind of the rise of these, the virtual meetings that actually end up working really well. I mean, personally, I was all ready to, I was ready to hate Zoom. I was ready. This will never take the place of in-person meetings. And, it's actually really good. So let's talk a little bit about kind of breaking the mold, right? Because, there is the kind of classical definition of quote unquote, what a biotech startup is supposed to look like. And, then things like this comes along and changes that, right? I think CROs have gotten smarter in a lot of different ways. And so how do you, in the middle of all this, how do you act as an advocate, as I suppose one thing, but really kind of an independent voice of reason in terms of like how companies can get built, right? If you're talking to seed stage investors and they're worried about where a company's going to put a lab, or they're worried about, the fact that there's two guys who have never met each other and they're on different ends of the earth. But their science is amazing and somehow they make it work. Like how do you see your role in that, and how do you kind of hold those conversations?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it legitimizes the idea of spending your summer in the Hamptons. And so, it doesn't have to be, around the world. It can be just, on which side of Long Island are you on? You can use
let's
Zoom
be honest. Yeah, if you're going to Montauk or as far out as either the Hamptons or Montauk in the summer, it might as well be the other end of the earth.
I want to pause. If there is anyone listening to this right now that has a studio in Montauk or the Hamptons, we will just email us.
Test the theory.
Please email us.
I think so. I think you can do it though. And I even say when I talk to a crowd in San Francisco, if you're in San Jose and you want to get to Marin County, you're better off doing a Zoom call. It doesn't pay to try to put yourself. You have to basically schedule a whole day of meetings in Berkeley and Marin County just to make it worthwhile. And 5 years ago, our behaviors, it involved so much unproductive drive time to have in-person encounters. I think the bar for that is way higher now. And I think that we're just being smarter and more strategic about how we place ourselves, in vivo with other people. And I think in vitro does have a much more, will play in a much more important role sociologically in how we move forward productively. And so I'll have this mantra around in vivo plus in vitro. I also have when I got involved with the seed stage business, we'd never really done anything with it before. I had to kind of build it. And I spent a lot of time just thinking about where the economy is headed, and not in terms of like financial terms, but in sociological terms. And I remember distinctly, I don't remember what time of year it was, but I just remember spending some time on World Economic Forum's website and finding an article that the World Economic Forum put forth talking about the fourth industrial revolution and talking about the digitization and localization of all sort of industries. And I was thinking to myself, like, how does that impact banking, which is it forever been a zip code oriented craft? And if everything's going geo agnostic and going sort of digital and local at the same time, how does that influence banks? And I thought, well, banks are about being the fabric of the community. And so the definition of community is actually being turned on its head. And so what came out of that was a buzz phrase that I've been using, which is that affinity will supplant geography in the definition of community in the innovation economy. So with the advent of Zoom and sort of all these technology enabling things, it actually allows a founder in Switzerland to very easily work with a founder in New York, who's also working with a founder at TMC in Houston. And the thread that's holding those individuals together is the fact that they're all world leaders in this particular type of science, and they're working together to advance that science. And I'm seeing a lot of that. And the other thing I'm noticing too is that I get a lot of inbound on LinkedIn from founders all over the world, and that conversation is the same no matter what political domicile you reside in, provided that you sort of speak the universal scientific language, which these days is English. You can have as productive a conversation no matter where you are. And so that's all just sort of moving forward. And so I think, the challenge that comes out of it for banks like Silicon Valley Bank is that the Kevin Bacon game does not work anymore. You can't just know all the investors and make all of those connections analog, because there are too many permutations for that to matter. Like 20 years ago, there were 20 investors doing all the work in biopharma, and we could sort of cover that landscape and feel good about it. Yeah. Today, there are 720 investors doing biopharma work. And so we've had to leverage technology as well to try to ensure that we actually can enable investor discovery for our clients. And that's what gave birth to CipherBio, which is I can put it in the chat. Can I put something in the chat?
Of course you can. Absolutely.
Yeah, you should be able to.
It's CipherBio is just something we built, which is now an sort of an SVB product, I guess. But it's designed as a research tool to help figure out who's doing what funding. And, there's a question about valuations. CipherBio is a great tool for being able to, wrap your brain around valuations and so forth. So part of how we add value in the sort of the new world order is through trying to use technology to help, make the process of helping our clients a little bit more sort of discernible and linear.
Sure, we've actually go ahead.
Go
This
ahead.
actually dovetails right into this. So there's a
Yeah.
question about how, AI is going to impact things like, banking, biotech risks, that kind of thing. And I'll twist it because, it's, as you said, an early stage biotech company, doesn't have the assets to be, something that you can do with venture debt. Really, like a lot of it is data on paper, right? Which AI probably has a very hard time valuing or anything like that. So do you see AI actually having an impact on early stage banking, lending, finance, et cetera? Or is that going to be kind of a place that's really untouched by that, at least for a little while?
So AI is going to help us with investor discovery for sure, because it's interesting. Investors aren't always clear about what they're investing in. I think if you're a VC, you're worried about sort of the lemming effect and herd instinct.
Yeah.
And so if you're coy about what you're investing in, then that solves for that. But at the same time, you have to get the word out about what you're interested in. And I just feel like that's murky. So I think we'll be able to use AI to help solve for that. I think that AI will help companies specifically with how they manage through their clin dev. So I think that's a huge issue, I think, because, and this is not about banking, this is more about companies, because I'm of the opinion that when it comes to valuation and it comes to like, what is the exit multiple? It's a finite universe of activity. You have only so much capital available, and you have only so many companies that are innovating. And I feel like the direction that things are going is that the amount of capital available is not growing nearly as fast as the number of innovative opportunities in life science and healthcare. And that's going to drive down exit valuations because it's a function of supply and demand. If there's way more supply, then there's just only so much market value that the market can absorb on an exit. So what I've been going around talking about is that, if you think you're going to get $1 billion exit on your technology, I would ask you how you're going to get to a 3x exit multiple off of, or a 3x return on investment off of $100 million exit valuation because of this phenomenon. And so then it leads you very quickly to be like, wow, how am I going to get this thing to exit to a phase 2B, let's say, on $30 or $40 million? Because if I'm going to deliver a 3x return to my investors at $100 million exit valuation, I've got to only have 30 or 40 million in. Well, these days to get to 2B, it's a $200 or $300 or $400 million conversation. And so I think, the advent of technology to help founders scale their early stage discovery faster is a big part of how you take that cost out of the equation and solve for a reasonable financial exit on way less capital. So I think there's a ton of opportunity, I think, for companies to innovate there. But and I think there were some questions on valuation. That to me is my biggest fear on valuation, is that we're starting to see, we're definitely seeing valuation sort of fracturing at the series sort of B and C rounds. Mm-hmm. We're seeing, if you you're lucky these days if you don't get down rounded, and if you bring in new outside capital, you're going to have a down round no matter what. I'm wondering how much of that is a function of this idea that this ratio of companies to capital available. That said, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, is it that, or is it kind of the hangover from everybody raising 100, 200, $250 million Series A's that were just basically looked at as kind of gateways to an IPO when the window was open? And now that the window is not open anymore, and you need to raise capital again because you're in this middle zone where you're not ready for an exit. You probably aren't that far clinically yet, right? There's when the Series B and Series C investors are the only game in town, that's gonna drive things down. And also you had the market cratering too, right? It's kind of like the perfect storm of
Yep.
not a lot of fun for anybody that raised a couple $100 million in an A round 2 years ago.
That's correct. And the ones who are having the ones who are having the most difficult time on that are companies that are still private that never went IPO off of that. Because the idea was, if you were going to raise, a $50 million seed and then a $90 million Series A and then flip right, and then what you're supposed to be doing is flipping right into an IPO at a $300 or $400 million valuation. If you didn't do that, you're hating life right now from a dilution perspective.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're not going to raise capital. It just means that your lot in life just shrunk on account of
you're going to raise it, but you're not going to enjoy it very much.
Yeah,
No.
the capital is much, much more expensive. Right?
Yeah.
But I also say too that this is another mnemonic that I like to use with founders who are worried about dilution, is that 10% of $1 billion is 10x more than 100% of 10 million. So the idea is, if you can get to that $1 billion exit and you end up with only 10% of the company, that's worth 10x more than if you try to maintain, total ownership over your company and, couldn't raise the capital and then couldn't develop the company and then couldn't get the, the exit outcome. So there's sort of there's a balancing act there. And of course, the overall valuation environment obviously influences that, but it's not as apparent though, like at the seed stage. Right now, seed stage valuations are definitely maintaining and actually in some cases increasing. And I think what's happening is investors, because there's a ton of fresh capital available. Last year, let me just look, I have a slide on this actually. I want to get my math right. So 2021, there was 28.3 billion in funds raised for life science and healthcare in the US. That's 2021. 2022, there was 21.8 billion. So it went from 28 down to 21. That was the second highest funding raise year ever. I mean, bearing in mind that in 2012, the US raised 3.6 billion. So we're like 10x higher than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
This year through Q1, we've raised $6.8 billion of capital allocated to healthcare and life science. So if you annualize that, that puts you at almost the same level of fundraising as 2021.
Well,
So,
is fundraising usually flat throughout the year? Is it quarter based?
It's lumpy. It is lumpy. It's possible that 100% of the funds could have raised in Q1 of this year, and we end the year with a 7 handle. But
that'd be bad. We don't want to do that.
And I don't think that but I would say that, analyzing off of a Q1 is a little risky, but just for illustrative purposes, if you did that, you're looking at 28 or 29, billion of funds raised this year. My point is that those dollars need to get deployed within the next couple of years.
Right.
We're not seeing limited partners ask for their capital back yet. I'll put that out there as a rhetorical.
Stop it. No.
Yeah.
That never happens. That just never happens. What happens is instead is the VCs try to figure out how can they get the most bang for their buck? How can they deliver the most value to their investors? And so what the VCs are thinking right now, it's a little bit of a pressure cooker for VCs, as it kind of always is, I guess, in one way or another. But they're definitely heavily investing in early stage because none of those companies have priced rounds. And so you can basically go in and have an agreement on a valuation that everybody feels comfortable with, because you don't have a valuation hanging over your head. But if you already have a priced round on your cap table, that's a big problem, because the VCs are going to come in and want to invest at the valuation that they think is right for them at this time. And whatever that is going to be not as attractive of a step up as, or maybe it's not even a step up as what your current valuation is. And so that creates friction with existing investors and with management. And so VCs are waiting around for those companies to run out of internally available capital, where the companies actually have to capitulate and bring in new, fresh outside capital. Yeah. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, when is that going to happen? When are you going to start to see companies capitulating and having to raise outside rounds? Because then it's going to be a later stage feeding frenzy for the VCs who are finally able to get into these companies at attractive valuations that are going to be disruptive, I think, to existing cap tables. Or not. Maybe the economy that we don't head into recession. Maybe the economy actually turns around, which there are quite a few economists out there right now that are saying we could get out of this without a recession, and maybe valuations rebound, and maybe you had enough dry powder with your existing investors to actually bridge that valuation gap. and you dodge a bullet. But not everybody's going to be immune to that. And a lot of VCs, I think, are kind of waiting to jump on that opportunity. And then what I think is going to happen is investing activity is going to shift actually away from the early stage toward later stage. And we could see a slowdown in early stage activity just because investors have decided that, grounds are more fertile elsewhere in the series cycle.
Yeah, there's one
almost
other,
like a wave, right? That's as it goes through the valuation series.
there's
But if you're a
another
biopharma company, you're going to have to get through at least one of these cycles, no matter what, because timelines are so long. Unless, again, if you can short circuit your clin dev process somehow, and maybe get it so that you don't have to, navigate multiple cycles, that's actually a risk. That's another way to mitigate risk on the valuation side.
Yeah. So there's another piece here that I think is interesting, and I don't know if this is going to cause a shift or not, but I'm very interested to see what happens as, I think we have a greater proportion of platform companies that have been founded in the last 5 years than we had in really the last decade. And I think that's being, there's a force that's driving more of that with kind of even though I hate this name, it's what's called the tech bio crowd, right? The folks that are looking at how technology and other things can accelerate platforms, either discover more drugs or discover better drugs, et cetera, right? So you're going to have these companies that are going to, and probably should, vehemently resist being valued on their first asset, right? So it's not just the first thing that you put into the clinic, but what does your actual pipeline look like? And there's going to be pressure on what the valuations of those companies are, right? Because later stage capital basically says, I will value your first asset at X, and then I will value your, the rest of your pipeline at, 0.001X because, I don't care, right? And I wonder if I think there kind of eventually needs to be a shift there. If you have these companies that are predicated on being really good at discovering lots of good drugs, right? And the good is important there, right? Just discovering lots of compounds doesn't really get you anywhere. They have to actually be good. But I think if we have capital that is going after more better shots on goal, eventually that has to be reflected in valuations. And I don't know if that's happening right now.
I think that's part of how you might solve for the $100 million exit conversation too.
You'd like to, right? I mean, that's the founder math, but it has to be the venture math too.
Yeah, I think, so this is where if we had an attorney online on the panel, the attorney could weigh in here, because I think part of it has to do with, do you break those assets up into separate companies? And then does that therefore allow you to have a better handle on valuation? I've seen some companies do that.
That's the
other one that
the
other thing I think is really interesting is a company that no longer exists. They got acquired, but it was a company called Array Biopharma out of Boulder, Colorado, where they were a publicly traded company, and just through selling rights, got themselves to a multi-billion-dollar exit, and they just kept developing new oncology drugs, and all of them were really pretty early stage even at the time of exit. But I haven't seen very many examples of that, but it's a fascinating example of how you, even as a publicly traded company, you can actually find ways to capitalize your way through that platform by having strategic relationships with the strategics. And so the VCs weren't even involved in that company at all.
Yeah.
Although I think not totally true. I think Boulder Ventures was I think Boulder Ventures was an early investor in that company. But anyway, they were public. So that's another fascinating example. It doesn't happen that often, but it's just, to me, really, really an interesting way of finding success.
Well, what's going to be interesting to me is there's, the people who know, right, loved working with that company. They're like the people who know said that company had like the best, med chem people on the planet. And what's going to be really interesting to me is to see what kind of things pop up in and around Boulder with those folks involved, right? This is kind of a classic, thing where you've got an acquisition, you actually have stuff now that gets spun out in the aftermath that is doing good science with people that, where the ecosystem knows they can deliver, right? So I'm actually really excited to see what comes out of that.
Me too. And it's Boulder. It's hard to argue with Boulder.
It really is. No, it's not different. It's no New York, but really, if you like to ski, that is not a bad place to be.
Yeah, I have 3 sons. My youngest son CU Boulder is on his list of schools. So next month we're going there to tour. And other than the altitude, I can't wait.
I would visit my child at that college.
There's a ton going on in the value, like managing through valuation, managing through capital. It's interesting though, like it's always hard to raise capital in biopharma. And I think it's getting harder when you think about this whole notion that the universe of relationships between sort of university and hospital tech transfer and investors is starting to sort of stratify. I feel like certain investors are doing a lot of throughput with certain areas of tech dev. And you have investors who were early on and sort of building out those moats, if you will. And then you have investors who are trying to build new moats. And so there's like moat building that's happening. And that depending upon where your tech is coming out of, you may or may not have access to certain investors just based on proximity, because some of these investors who are doing that work, like they're full with pipeline. They can't take on new funding opportunities because they're full on the ones from the moats that they've built. So whether you're talking about, Kendall Square, or whether you're talking about Palo Alto or whatever, like I feel like there's been some stratification there. I wonder at what point, or what causes that stratification to be disrupted. And then on the other hand, you have I'm also noticing sort of seed funds pop up that are a few people who are really well versed on the latest version of a very specific type of science, and they are basically trying to do very early investments in promising technologies as a setup for larger funds to come in down the road whose investing appetite is such that they can't put only $10 million to work. They've got to put 40 or 50 to work to make it happen. Right. And that's a function of your fund size. So as fund sizes have gotten larger, it's created sort of this search fund almost methodology where you have small funds where the LPs are maybe the big funds, and they're doing that. But the point I want to make though is if with $50 billion of capital in the last couple of years that's been invested, that money needs to find a home somewhere.
It does.
And there's going to be another 20 or 30 this year that's going to be invested. One more data point I want to put out there. Obviously, coffee's starting to take effect here, but
you're like,
one more data
15
point.
more minutes. We have 30 more minutes of material.
Right, exactly. Keep talking faster. Is that so? If you look at the Silicon, so for those of you who are wondering where is Ben getting his data, Silicon Valley Bank every quarter now, but it's more robust twice a year that we do a quarterly update. We just did our Q1 update. Does something called the Healthcare Investments and Exits Report. If I could multitask at all, I could
do it. I got you. Keep talking. I got you.
Yeah. And so that's where this data is coming from. And so we're showing $6.8 billion of capital raised into healthcare and life science in Q1. If you go to the NVCA Q1 report, it shows something like $11.7 billion of total capital, venture capital raised in Q1. So if you assume for a moment that the data sets between SVB and NVCA are highly correlated, which they should be, that would mean that life science and healthcare fundraising in the US consisted of almost 60% of total fundraising, which I've not really ever seen a quarter where it's been more than maybe 30%. And 10 years ago, it was more like 13%. And so if it's true, and I think there is some truth to it, because it's really, really difficult on the tech side right now. Tech is in a very big reckoning period right now, but life science and healthcare, not so much. It's always hard to raise funding, but I don't think that life science and healthcare is suffering the same fate as the broader economy. I don't think that the headline risk really applies. I think investors are continuing to do their good work. I think companies are continuing to do their good work. I think the reason why is because life science and healthcare is not affected by some of the economic swings that tech companies are affected by. Because for a tech company, your SaaS revenues could fall off a cliff in a hurry if the economy is disrupted. Life science and healthcare, not true. So and that's a part of it's a function of our healthcare system. So I think the risks to capital deployment in healthcare have more to do with risks to our healthcare costs and healthcare system than they do to sort of the overall economy. But for biopharma in particular, it's really more about drug development and just the math associated with, I feel like the infinite permutation of opportunities to develop technology and the finite amount of capital available.
So let me ask you this. So if you're thinking, if in fact we've had that much more funds raised that are going in, right, to healthcare and life sciences. That has to mean new investors, right, that were previously putting their capital elsewhere. And I've always sort of heard the thought that it's you have more specialized investors, right, in life science and healthcare, because there are fewer people that not only have the long window, but that can kind of understand, right, what companies are trying to do. So how do you think that we bridge some big gap in sort of comfort level of investing in something that's going to be a longer term investment? Or what do you think the macro forces are there?
So I'm going to name off some names of some funds who raised in Q1 into healthcare and life science to give you an idea of where I'm going with the answer to this question. So NEA, Bain Capital, SR1, F Prime, 8VC, Sequoia. You've got some tech names in there that are raising massive amounts of capital going into healthcare and life science. Now, granted, some of it is AIML for healthcare or health tech. So some of it's like either tech bio or tech health tech, I like to call. But some of it is like, if you look at Google Ventures, they have very, very scientific GPs running the life science and healthcare end of their world. I don't know where they were this quarter, but historically they've always been at the top of the charts in terms of number of deals done in drug discovery. And so I think that as a fund, you have to have GPs who understand the science. And that's, to me, the line of demarcation in terms of in terms of how those funds succeed. I think that there was a time when there was so much hubris that, I'll pick on Sequoia, I guess, but not that this is not a true statement. It's just picking on a big name, that Sequoia probably thought, well, we can just get into the biopharma field and take our existing partners and do it. And the reality is, no, you can't do that. There's a lot of know-how there. I also believe that's part of, this whole 10% of a billion being 10x more than 100% of 10 million. In order to bring in the top minds for the type of science that you're doing, you're going to have to give up a lot of dilution. But the hope then is you're going to gain a tremendous amount in terms of network, strategic opportunity, relationship. Derek, we talked earlier about relationships. It's not just about the relationships you have with your scientific and financial advisors. It's also about their neural networks. And, are you logarithmically amplifying your relationship connectivity by the types of individuals you associate with and how they identify back to the technology that you're developing? I think that's important. It can also lead to some groupthink and some almost maybe too linear logarithmic in a way, in terms of having too narrow of your depth of focus. So there is this balance, I think, between breadth and depth. But you're going to end up, to get the best talent, you're going to end up giving up the most dilution. But then the theory is you should be able to make it up in the long run on valuation.
So we've had a good question from the audience. I think this probably is the right place to put it. So the question is, they're curious about the trends in funding directed towards women and underrepresented founders. Have you seen these efforts to be effective in supporting diversity and life science leadership? And are there other ways that we can help fund diverse leadership teams at all stages?
Yeah, well, it's definitely, so diversity in life science and healthcare as a general theme is something that is on everyone's minds. And there are all kinds of things that are happening to try to support improvements in diversity in life science and healthcare. And so, whether that be the Ignite program that exists out of Texas, or Anton Xavier, who is in New York City and is one of the members of my team, has built a diversity, equity, and inclusion related program with also called Ignite, interestingly, related to Lab Central. And there's a consortium of organizations that have been involved in that, which actually offers incentives to support diversity, equity, inclusion in life science and healthcare. There are funds out there that are actually dedicating themselves to the deployment of capital into management teams that represent diverse teams. And so I think, as a result of the heightened awareness, there's also heightened sort of activity and heightened solidarity, I guess I would use, around commitment toward improving, diversity, equity, and inclusion in life science and healthcare. And what I like about it is it's pretty broad based, and I haven't seen the math. I haven't actually looked at the latest math, but there have been positive trends in terms of probability of, raising funds as, a woman or person of color in life science and healthcare. I'll put this out there just as sort of a rhetorical, if you look at the topic in terms of whether or not the founder was born in the United States, that data, it gets really crazy, because a significant percentage of the diversity represented in life science and healthcare in the United States is actually represented by people who are not born here, who can't come to the U.S. to become educated and to develop their path of self-actualization. If you strip that group out, we have a tremendous amount of work to do in this country when it comes to U.S. citizens getting into STEM programs. So, like, women, people of color getting into STEM programs, getting educated in STEM universities, and going on. That number needs to change significantly. And so we have to, I think, make wholesale changes to how we think about supporting STEM as early as grade school, to make sure that STEM programs are something that people gravitate toward. Whatever we have to do sociologically to do that, I feel like it has to go as far back as really early, getting people interested in science and technology really early in their lives.
Yeah, and we have a new chapter of Life Science Cares in New York, which has been fantastic. And they are obviously focused on that. And then at New York Bio, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force, which includes New York Bio members, but also non-members in our community. And our summer intern is spending almost her entire internship exclusively helping us with programming and DE&I task force work, which we're really looking forward to implementing. So.
Yeah, I also think too that the price of admission for the work that happens in biopharma is advanced degrees in science. But to do that, you have to get more people interested in going to college. There's just so much that we have to do sociologically around that happens long before you are a PI working in a lab, trying to transfer out your first technology. That's sort of where where I'm angling is what can we do? How far back can we go and still feel like we can have a measurable impact? I think there's some relationship there that I hopefully will continue to improve over time.
Yeah, I think anytime you start the discussion around, how do we impact the industry and how do we change the industry, you invariably start to say we need to go earlier, right? At every stage you say we need to go earlier to fix it, but there's not enough at the top of the funnel to help. This is a systematic challenge. And in order to fix the system, you have to go back to basically elementary education. You have to go back to who are the kind of kids that get into science and how do we improve the level of diversity really at that age? Because if you don't do it, the drop off and the attenuation throughout that is so steep that unless you have all of this part of the spectrum interested in it, you don't get there from a numbers perspective.
It's also really hard. Like biopharma is like the hardest thing you can do.
Yeah.
And how many people actually make it to so I'm taking a little liberty here because I'm the first person to go to college in my family. And so, it's just that in and of itself for me was a big challenge. Even sociologically to this day, it's still a challenge. And because I broke ranks with what the trades, I was expected to go on the trades and that, but I wanted to go to college. But I'm sure there's so many college students who get in there and they start down their biopharma track and they're like, this is too hard. And then they switch to a non-science, non-STEM track, which is fine. But I think that happens also quite a bit where it's there's so many layers you have to get through to get to the point where you're actually doing, the new science, that it's just, I agree. It's almost like at every level along the way, you have to try to ensure that you keep encouraging people to plow forward, take on the hard work and just try to do the hard stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. At a time too, where let's be honest, college is becoming almost prohibitively expensive.
Yep.
For a lot, as I have a rising senior this next fall.
Yep.
We're intimately familiar with that.
When the bank failed, I was at the University of Miami with my son, choking on a $90,000 a year tuition.
Oh, God.
So,
Oh, no, my kids are 11 and no, we don't have enough. We've got 3 minutes left. My kids are 11.
At least the weather was good.
It's true, though.
We don't have time for this.
I was literally choking.
Oh,
so
man.
he's not going to go there, but
so we only have 3 minutes. So I know we talked about sort of this decentralized, right, approach. Certainly SVB has a decentralized approach geographically to early stage, your early stage business and the partners, right, that you help in that. But we are NewYorkBIOs. So talk to us a little bit about what you expect to see out of the New York ecosystem in the coming years. How about that? And we'll close it out with that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have 3 directors who are responsible for early stage business development, and 2 of the 3 are in New York. And so if that gives you any, well, New York / New Jersey, I'll be more specific.
Yeah, we'll adopt our friends across the river.
I think, so New York to me is fascinating because even in the last 5 years, New York has gone from a place where really interesting science happens, and then the founding teams, like when they get past a certain point, leave the city to go do their work somewhere else, to a place where people are coming to do their work. And it's been a profound transformation that I've absolutely observed. And I go all over the world, but primarily the US, investigating early stage science activity. And I would say that New York is by far, am I on record? I will not go on record by saying that New York is by far the most prolific geographic area with life science activity right now. I think that, and Derek, I think we were talking about this last time we were together about, why is that? And I think it has to do with the concerted community effort to invest more mindshare into the development of life science technology. And that's happening across a very broad base. And I think what you're finding is that when the community puts their mind to something, it actually can happen. And now we're starting to see other states follow suit. And so now it's sort of, I feel like it's a little bit of an arms race between states, where if you're a state and you don't have a proactive community effort toward advancing life science, you're going to fall behind. And, I see states like New York doing it. I see, the Research Triangles doing more. I'm seeing, obviously Texas is doing a lot more. There are definitely states that, and it's interesting, is there's a lot of money and science behind those, what those states are doing. But I think New York led the way on that. And so, the question now is, how does New York stay on top? Because, by the way, New York did a lot more activity than Massachusetts in Q1, like 2 to 1 activity in favor of New York for seed and Series A activity. And so if that trend continues, then I think that's going to be highly disruptive to Kendall Square. It's going to be highly disruptive to, Sand Hill Road. One of the things I know our time, but, one of the last themes that I've been thinking about is the genie out of the bottle, and is the deployment of capital going to be away from Boston and NorCal now forever, or will we see happen what happened 10 years ago, which is all the activity started concentrating back into Sand Hill Road and Cambridge when times got really tough in terms of availability of capital. I think the genie's out of the bottle. And most of the people I talk to, except for the people in Cambridge and in Sand Hill Road, also say the genie's out of the bottle. But I think that's another big rhetorical out there for us to be thinking about moving forward. But I think New York has done like everything right as far as optimizing for success around the sort of the geographic theater of early stage life science activity.
Well, I can't think of a better way to leave it than with that statement. Ben, thank you. This was a great discussion, and we really appreciate your joining us today. Everyone, I hope you have a great Tuesday, and we'll see you back here next week.
Thank you.
Enjoy, everybody.